Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello, and welcome to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, perhaps the greatest story ever told. We're very pleased to have you with us today, whether it's your first time or you're a regular visitor here. My name's David Payne, and I'll be your host for this, the 34th episode of our journey through Mark's Gospel, which we think is as relevant to life in the 21st century as it was when it was first written down. And today, it's our great pleasure to introduce our very special guest, Anne Middleton. Anne is in Plymouth, I believe. She's our minister's wife, and her title, she told me, is Performing Arts Mission Enabler for Plymouth and Devonport Methodist Circuit. Anne, tell us, what does that mean? What do you do, and how do you know Steph?
Oh, that's lots of questions. Well, I started my role in January 2020, and it brings together kind of everything I love doing. It's like the idea of me. I absolutely love it. And so I think quite early on in my role, someone put Steph in touch, put us in touch together. And then, of course, because of the pandemic, it took months and months, didn't it, to actually finally meet and have him perform in Plymouth at an event that I run called Hope Theatre Cafe.
Fantastic. It's lovely to have you here. So what does your role involve? What do you do? What is it that is your heart's desire?
So I get to put on productions with the circuit. So our first circuit production was Passion, which I actually wrote in 2008, and we've done it with the Rotherham circuit and the Cardiff circuit. And we were about to put it on. We were 2 weeks off putting it on here in 2020, and obviously all the churches shut. So we did that this year in Holy Week, and that was really amazing. So that's working with members of the congregations. So there's 17 churches in the Plymouth and Devonport circuit, Methodist circuit. That was working with congregations. And then I also organised this event called Hope Theatre Cafe that Stefan was a part of, where I invite Christian performers, and they could be anything from, actors, musicians, poets, magicians. And the idea is that they come and do their thing, but there's always a message of hope. But it takes place in the churches. I've been moving around the churches, and we set it up like a cafe. So people come and they have coffee and homemade cake, and they watch a performance with a message of hope. Amazing. And then there's lots of other bits and pieces as well. And one of the things I really love is being able to write. So in my job now, I'm actually paid, because you know what it's like, Stefan, and actually you don't really get paid for the writing process. But now, obviously, it's part of my job, and I love to write. So I'm writing a new play at the moment. I won't go into that today. And I've actually started writing poetry since lockdown, and I really love that, particularly the little Japanese style haiku. Really into those. But and then circuit worship. I bring the circuit together for services every 3 months, something like that, and always write a drama on the theme and get people involved with that. So, but I just I love it. It's all creative, loads and loads of opportunities.
Sounds absolutely great. Sounds really, really good. And apparently you're going to be at Edinburgh after us. Is that right?
Yeah, no, it's weird. I randomly got invited by the connection. I hope this isn't confidential. I don't think it is. And we're called missional listeners or something. And we're going to go and kind of check out the Fringe for 3 days. So I'm going all the way from Plymouth to Edinburgh. Apparently there's a plane, and it's a lot quicker and cheaper. So anyway, I'm popping up, and just to see what they do and what we can learn from it, and what we can kind of bring back to our own circuit. So it's very exciting. But I just miss Stefan, don't I?
You do, sadly. I miss you, which is even worse.
Thank you, Anne. That's absolutely brilliant. And For those watching on YouTube, you can see the T-shirt as well. She's on a really, really hot day. She's wearing a thick T-shirt just for us. So make sure you watch on YouTube.
With my logo.
With the logo. And Stefan, I am fairly sure people will know something about you. Your one man and a chair presentation of Mark's Gospel will have been to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. If you're on YouTube, you will see the chair, or about a quarter of it anyway.
Yes.
For the second time, by the time this episode's available. Steph, I don't know how many times you performed at Iron Mark, but I wonder what it's like, what it is that most strikes you about Jesus when you take on the role.
Wow, that's a fascinating question. So I'll keep it short. So it is actually awesome to play Jesus, not awesome as in exciting, although it is. It's awesome as in terrifying, in a sense, because you are supposed to be personifying the Son of God, the Lord of the universe. How can anyone presume? But I guess I've been helped mostly by my director, Lisa Gilmore, who has thought about the characterization and has really helped me understand that everything that Jesus does and says is born out of unconditional love. And even when he does lose his temper, which he does actually, especially with the disciples, there is nevertheless that desire to bless and to serve that's beneath and between it all. And that's the most extraordinary thing. And it's absolutely amazing considering that. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you ever so much. Thank you. I did wonder that. Okay, let's get started, shall we? So today's reading is going to be read for us by Lucy. It's Mark 8, 34 to 9, verse 1. And then we'll get on with the discussion.
Mark chapter 8, verses 34 to 38, and chapter 9, verse 1, New International Version, the way of the cross. Then he called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." And he said to them, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power."
Well, thank you, Lucy. So firstly, Anne, we'll let the guest go first, if that's all right. What are your initial thoughts, I wonder, when you look at this passage? Is there a main point you'd like to start with? And you'll get an opportunity to say more later.
Well, I have to admit, because I had a little chat with Stefan before this, I'm not a theologian, and I approach the Bible in a certain way. So when I approach the Bible, I like to see, a message of hope. That's my everything's about hope. And I have to say, I looked at this passage and I was like, oh no, I can't really see anything. And it seemed to be one of those passages that was a bit like, oh, thou shalt not do this, and it's all a bit depressing. And I have to say, I don't know if your other guests usually do this, but I just thought I'm going to have a little look at the Message version, which I just occasionally do when I'm looking at a passage and I just feel like I need a different kind of angle on it. And then straight away I read, "Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat, I am." And suddenly, from this carry a cross and all of that suffering, it suddenly jumped out at me, and it was so relevant for my life. And there was a few bits like that obviously we're talking a bit more detail after, but I have to say, yeah, I did get a little bit of help from the Message, but then it did spring to life for me.
No, that's great. That's great. Thank you. Steph, what about you? What's the main thing you'd like to talk about?
I'm so glad that that Anne's mentioned that, because for me personally as well, it really speaks in a similar way. And I'm so looking forward to chatting with you, Anne, about how God is moving in each of our lives in this particular way. It's amazing. But I have to say also, I'm so bamboozled and fascinated by particularly the last part of this little passage, where it talks about the kingdom of God coming in power, and where it talks about some people who are not going to die before they see it happening, and also all this stuff about Jesus being ashamed. It just fills me with kind of questions, actually, and that's what I'd love to think about and talk about later on.
Okay, thank you. That's great. So I think what we'll do is we'll let Anne speak about some of the issues presented by the passage to her. And Steph, I'm sure you can speak to that as well. And then Steph, I thought for a while we'd warn our listeners out with requests for questions, but they didn't let us down after all. And we do have some questions to look at the passage itself. Let's see where that takes us. And Anne, of course, again, feel free to chip in as you wish. This is a conversation between friends. So Anne, do you want to start off with what else comes out of this passage for you? The way of the cross.
Do you want me to say a bit more about why the bit about the driver's seat?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah,
we could rename it, couldn't we? God in the driving seat. Yeah.
So yeah, for me, this kind of season of pandemic has been a real kind of liminal space, and God's been speaking to me so much through it. And actually, funnily, although I didn't come across this passage in relation to that, it really fits in with, you know, some of the theme. And so for me, I've learned a lot about myself. I really rely a lot on routine, and I plans are really important to me. If something's in my diary, it's set in stone. Drives my husband mad. So through lockdown, obviously what happened is all the plans I'd made, set like about to put on my first production in my role. It was really important to me. It's important to God, but it was really important to me in my role that I did this well. And the church is shut. And it was really, really frustrating. And one of the things I felt God say to me is, you know, Anne, just let go and go with my flow. So I've had this thing, go with God's flow. So this passage, you know, you're not in the driver's seat, I am, it just really jumps out at me. So I know one of the things I've learned about myself is that I do have specific learning difficulties. I literally randomly discovered this through lockdown when I ended up randomly doing an online course. And I do have a lot of problems with my brain function. And there is an official term for one of the problems I have, which is working memory deficit. And I realized that a lot of my rigid routines are all about my need to remember, literally they're functioning. So for example, I've got a fun example. In the morning, I let the dog out for a wee, let her in again, wipe her paws, put her in her bed. And then I know when I let her out of her bed, I feed her. If someone else comes along, notices the dog's in her bed, lets her out, of course they're not going to feed her, are they? So the dog could actually starve if I don't follow my routines. And that's just a silly example, but I've got lots of things like that, really, really rigid. And I think it became a thing though, that I needed things planned out. I needed to get kind of some control over because in my brain, I didn't quite understand what was wrong with it. But then I think God was saying to just let me take the driver's seat. Although he didn't say that at the time, but now I'm saying that's exactly what he's saying. Let me be in the driver's seat. And actually, for example, the Passion, 2 years later, in that time, we had 2 new ministers to the circuit. One of them ended up playing Judas. One of them ended up playing Jesus. And talking about what it's like to play Jesus. And honestly, this minister came along, and I just said to my husband, Darren, who directed it, I produced it, there's something about him. I think he could play Jesus. And honestly, he, you know, when you talk about playing Jesus, for me, it was like he just had to find the Jesus that was already within him. Yeah, and it was absolutely beautiful. All he'd done is played the Tin Man in a school play once, never acted before, but just the most amazing, you know, it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, that's just a small example, but just this thing that if I actually just let go and let God do his thing and trust. So for me, it was like, no, we've done all, you know, it's got to happen now. And I was praying that the churches wouldn't shut, because, you know, we were at that point where we were waiting. Yes. And actually, if I can just let go, let God do his thing, you know, I think it was probably more amazing than it might have been the first time around.
Isn't that fantastic? Steph, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, add to it. I can't add to it, but I can definitely, mirror it in a sense, I guess. I totally see that. And to be honest, I beat myself up about this particular subject quite a lot, because I recognize that God's challenge to us, perhaps me certainly, and it sounds like for you as well, Anne, is not to be in control, actually, and to let him take control. And it's so easy, isn't it, to want to take control. And I haven't got necessarily those same difficulties that you have, but nevertheless, my personality is such that I love to see everything organized and pinned down as you've described it. And, and honestly speaking, I realize other people might be listening to our conversation here. Honestly speaking, I struggle with this sense of, Lord, it's okay, I can do it. I know exactly what we can do here. This is what we're going to do. I suggest we do this. And frankly, that's never going to work. And I think the Christian life for me is about letting go, as you say, and putting to one side your sense of autonomy and your desire for independence. And that is so hard, isn't it? Because I don't know about you, it is for me. I keep bouncing back. That independent spirit keeps bouncing up and down and saying, "Oh no, come on! I've done a little bit of surrender, Lord, but now, come on, let's have another go. Me being in charge, me being in the driving seat." So I think you've really hit upon something here. I honestly do, and I think personally, this idea about life. I don't know if you had any thoughts about life and losing life and all that, but for me personally, that bit in the passage is all about, you think you're going to get life if you grasp control, but actually it's death. Real life comes in surrender, and the real quality of life, that vibrancy of life, the joy and the peace and the sense of being in sync with God comes from surrender. And we can surrender to him. It's not like he's a tyrant. He's the most loving person ever. It's not that we always believe that, but it is the case. And in surrendering to him, we find life.
Absolutely. I see. I get a little bit confused on the verses because it's so different in the message. But when you were talking about that, there was another bit that jumped out for me in the message version, and it says, "Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to saving yourself, your true self." And it talks about the true self. What good would it do to get everything you want and lose you, the real you? What could you ever trade for your soul? So again, just through this wording, I've thought a lot through lockdown. Me and my husband, as minister, I've talked about, he's got this thing, what would be a modern word for sin? Because it's a funny thing. And he came up with, and I really agree, ego.
Yeah.
And this passage for me really, it talked about that, not letting your ego rule. So when I think about ego, I think it's the selfishness, the greed, being self-focused, putting ourselves first, self. And then this true self, what is the true self? And there's been this phrase, be the you that God's created you to be. And it's like, what does this mean? And then so I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've got this just little example that I thought I could share, because it's just to bring it into a really everyday thing. So our daughter at school, she's learning how to respond to meanness. And children, she's 12, she's at senior school, and children can be a bit mean. And she's been through this thing, well, how can I react? What can I say back? So we've had these discussions in our home, and Darren sometimes is a protective father, and I'm like, maybe not that. And we're just finding ways of her responding, because one of the things I say to her is, you don't want to end up being the thing that you don't like in others yourself. Don't end up being a mean girl. And it just made me think, I say to her, just be yourself, darling, just be yourself. And I think it's so hard for children, and you can just see it really made me realize how at a young age we learn to put up these defenses, and it's become layers. And then as we're adults, we've got so many layers. People talk about peeling off the layers. For me, I think this is just a little example of what it means to be our true self, peeling off down to what God intended us to be. So with my daughter, I'm trying to say, try not to do this, like try and avoid this, be you now, and then you won't have to go through all the rubbish that adults go to when they're trying to strip that all away. You know what I mean? It's a struggle, isn't it? It's not easy.
Absolutely.
That was just a practical kind of thing about letting go of your ego and being your true self. And that was the way that I brought this into every kind of my everyday life.
Brilliant.
I don't know if that means anything
No, I
to
like
you.
that.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really good.
So is that what you think God means by Jesus means by saving their life and losing it, and that we have to lose our life for me and the gospel will save it?
Yeah, so I think that's the way, again, it's like how we approach it, isn't it? So I go by what's God saying to me through it, and I'm sure it means different things to other people.
Yeah.
But this way that we try and protect ourselves, don't we? But actually, if we let go and trust God, at the end of the day, He has got the best for us. So for me, that's kind of the way I see it, because when I read this, I don't experience things in the way that someone says. I'm quite a positive person, and when I come to the Bible, I tend to see all the good, because I really do see. I learned to see quite a few years ago, God is my loving Father, and He wants the best for me.
Yes.
So when I read a passage, I think, well, that doesn't quite. Like, some bits that are quite harsh, aren't there, stuff, and the bits that you're really interested in, and I'm like, well, that's a bit harsh. I don't see God like that, but. So I say, okay, what can I take from that? What are you saying to me? So yeah.
I love the fact that there's something for everybody in the Bible, that God does understand our differences, and we're all different, and we can think we've got to be very theological and well, like Steph basically, but we haven't.
Don't have to be at
Steph,
all.
what do you want to add to?
Well, I mean,
I know you're desperate to get onto the last section.
No. Well, just to talk about
the first section.
Yeah, in the first section. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because the bit when Anne just read out that section again, it just reminded me that he does mention, for me and for the gospel. So there's kind of maybe an extra, I don't know, but I'm wondering if there's an extra ingredient to what we've already agreed about. And it's about why we're in God's family, exactly. And there's more than, although it's true that Jesus loves us and He cares for us and wants the best for us. And, who can even begin to describe the immensity of that love? And I don't want to in any way underplay it. But it also seems to me that we're also part of something bigger than us. We're part of a dream which God has for the whole universe, the whole of creation. And it's like His big restoration plan. And so when we surrender in the way that we've described and let Him be in the driving seat, it's for a purpose, actually. We may know not quite the big picture, but there is a role for us in our lives as well towards fulfilling that dream. And sometimes that means, doing something perhaps that we may not particularly have wanted to do, or maybe not even envisioned. But that's the point about surrender. I mean, there's so much that can be said here, but I think for me personally, when I've thought about I Am Mark and what I'm doing with the presentation, I recognize that it may not always be great. It may not always be wonderful. People may not always, at the end of a performance, as they have done perhaps mostly so far, yeah, it was really brilliant. I really enjoyed that. God really spoke to me. It may not always be that. I mean, if I'm going to be living the gospel, I guess I'm going to have to face the fact that some people will say, I hated that. I really hate Christ. I don't like the idea of being a Christian. I hate Christians. And or whatever the words might be, it could land me in trouble. And I've been challenged by God recently. And the question I think He's been asking me is, are you all in? Are you all in? If you're going to follow me, are you all in? Or is it just a game? And not only recently, I think that's often a question He asks me. Is it just something I like to play at? Or is it something I really mean seriously? Am I prepared to give up everything for Him? And that's quite a big challenge, isn't it? It's not quite the same image of God as we've been talking about, but I still feel it's just as important in some ways. And yeah, for me, that really is something I'm still trying to work through, to be honest.
And one of the other things you said you wanted to mention was self-sacrifice and the true self. And there's clearly, this is about sacrificing yourself.
So that was the bit that I was just speaking about.
That's what you said. Sorry,
again, sorry, I keep referring to the message because it's just easier for me, but
Yeah.
I think it's verse 35. In the message says, don't run from suffering, embrace it, follow me and I'll show you how. And that was another thing through pandemic. So you probably gather I'm quite an intense person. I did start writing poetry. I did find myself in a deep pit that I had been in many years ago. And I had this thing that, oh no, this is it. I'm in a pit and it's like a tomb. My fear, it was like all my fears being hemmed in, and the possibility of not being able to breathe, that those were the things that grabbed my sort of dramatic attention. And so I was in this pit, and then I was expressing myself through poetry. And you probably see, if you've seen any of my videos, Stefan, you'll have seen. I suddenly had this thing where God was saying, well, for a start, God was right there with me in the pit, didn't go anywhere. But also he was showing me that it wasn't a tomb, but that it was more of a cocoon. And actually, God began to show me, I had this phrase, these passages that talking about finding treasure in dark places. And God was really showing me that rather than focusing on, oh no, I'm hemmed in, or that actually embrace this season. So this liminal space I think I spoke about before. And I just found that actually it became a really creative time. So instead of being like a dead, everything is stopped, my job that I've waited for years is stopped. Actually, it became a really creative time. And I thought some of the most beautiful creativity can come from brokenness. And it made me think of those, I can't think of the actual word for it, but the Japanese pots that when they're cracked, they fill the cracks with gold. And I've always loved that image. And then also there's a quote I love, I think it's Rumi, that says the crack is where the light gets in. So there's kind of all of this going on. And this, I don't know, I think in life, pain and love go hand in hand, and to fully embrace one, you kind of have to accept the other. But for me, it did become a really, really creative time. And actually, rather than everything stopping, I just had to find new ways. This was another thing God was saying, see, I'm doing a new thing. I had to find new ways of working. And I started making videos, which was a nightmare because I'm really untechnical, but I did have some help. But I was actually able to work with friends all around the country. So even though I was hemmed in, I was reaching out far further. I worked with a musician friend, Simeon Wood, who lives in Huddersfield, I think, another friend in London who's an artist, Angela, and we were able to collaborate and make some really beautiful work. And I would have never ever thought of doing that because it was out of my comfort zone. So there's something about liminal spaces, God taking us out of our comfort zones. But again, if we can just trust and go with the flow, God can bring something beautiful out. Again, it's me bringing positive out of the suffering, but I really do believe that.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, I think that will feed into what I wanted to say about the bits that are a bit hard, actually.
And now you've got the challenge, Steph, to make the hard bits positive. Because underneath all of that, there is a God who loves us, who thinks the world of us, isn't there? And we sometimes need to work at understanding some of that. We haven't really touched on the questions, Steph. I don't know if you want me to introduce one or two questions.
Yeah, why not?
So we have the conditions for following him are to deny yourself, take up your cross and lose your life. And what does this actually mean in practice? And maybe Anne's answered that a bit. Once we've picked it up, do we just keep carrying it? It would have been a shocking image to the first hearers. And of course, I only realized the other day, they weren't familiar with the idea of Jesus being on a cross at all.
No,
that was complete. But they knew what a cross would be.
So I think I'm going to answer that question by not answering it. And that sounds awful, but seriously, I think Anne's answered a lot of it actually for me, and what I'm thinking about in terms of suffering as well. But I think if we're really serious about looking at what this passage meant to the persons who first heard it, who are the crowd, who are also the 12. Yeah, you're absolutely right, David. The cross hasn't happened yet, but they would have been familiar with crosses. They would have seen it, and it's the most gruesome torture and death that I think anyone's ever invented. Certainly, it was pretty horrifying, and it was common for that sort of thing to happen to people. And what Jesus has just said here, in the verses just before is, I am going to suffer. And if you follow me, if you want to follow me, his actual words are, you too are going to have to face the fact that you will suffer in this way. In other words, suffering that incredible death. So it would have been definitely very shocking and would have put a lot of people off, I'm sure of it. So here, in a way, Jesus is saying, I'm giving you the choice. He's called all these people, at the beginning of the whole story, he's called Simon and Andrew and all those other guys, follow me. But now he says, if you want to carry on, if you want to follow me, if you want to, this is what's going to happen potentially next. And I want to really point that out, because I think I don't disagree with anything that's been said today, but there is a danger, at least in my mind, as I think about how we apply this passage, to kind of over sentimentalize it, maybe over spiritualize it, even perhaps a little bit, because I think the cross really means the cross, and they would have known it. And in fact, in chapter 13, Jesus says, you are going to come before the councils, and you're going to come before the synagogues, and you're going to have to speak up about me. But don't worry, because at that time the Holy Spirit is going to give you the words to say. So he knows in advance that these guys are going to come up against the same stuff he's going to come up with. So I think that's the first thing about the passage that really, I guess, I want to underline. And I think for them, it was a most awesome decision that they had to make. Do you want me to talk about the ashamed bit? Because I know that's a bit that gets people a little bit.
Yeah.
I think I've got to maybe try out a couple of ideas with you guys and see whether you think they're logical. How about if the whole passage actually fits in with the rest of the story? I mean, rather than it being about, and I know the end bit seems to be about, but rather than it being about some future date after the story's ended, maybe sometime in our future, let's just, for the sake of argument, suggest the whole passage actually fits in with the rest of the story so far and fits in with what happens next.
Yeah.
Well, I think then if you do that, I'm not saying that it doesn't refer to a future date, but I'm just saying if you do that, I think you began to see some things clicking together. He's actually talking to a physical crowd and some physical disciples, and he's saying, if any of you are ashamed of me, if any of you are ashamed of me, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him. What happens in the rest of the story? Well, of course, that's exactly what happens. Peter, for instance, is ashamed. And then if that's the case, probably someone might argue with me and say, well, hold on, but Jesus says, if you're ashamed of me when I come in my Father's glory with the holy angels, that's nothing to do with the story. We don't see Jesus coming on clouds with the holy angels in the story. It's obviously some future event. Well, maybe I would say to you, if you were arguing that, actually, I'm not sure if I agree. So I think, and this is maybe the whole key to Mark's gospel, this is why I think this passage is like so central, literally as well as symbolically. I think this actually refers to a real part of scripture in the Old Testament, which all the guys who would have read this to start with, and all the hearers of Jesus would have known, they would have been steeped in it. It's a passage in Daniel chapter 7, which talks about the Son of Man coming on the clouds to take dominion of all of creation, to basically have authority over all. And that's obviously a reference to Jesus. And it's a kind of a passage which talks about Jesus or the Messiah, let's not call him the Messiah because it's not mentioned as a Messiah, but the Son of Man, whoever that figure is, being enthroned. Well, once we get that passage in mind, you can begin to see how it does relate to the story in Mark. there is actually an enthronement. This is why Jesus says, in my opinion, humble opinion, because I could be completely wrong. This is why Jesus says at the end of this passage, some of you who are standing here will not taste death before you see the kingdom of God come with power. This actual event does happen in Mark. Mark makes it clear it happens all the way through. And the place it happens is the crucifixion and the resurrection. The crucifixion, because if you read it, you'll notice it's full of symbols, of ideas about enthroning. That's why Mark talks and reiterates the fact that the sign above Jesus's head on the cross is the King of the Jews. All the stuff is about enthroning. In other words, this is the moment, it could be argued, that the Son of Man comes on the clouds in his Father's glory with the holy angels. This is the moment in Daniel 7. It's not a physical thing that actually is happening before your eyes. It's a literary thing. It's actually back in the day. This is where Daniel had his dream. This is what the dream means. The dream means this, the crucifixion. And that means the crucifixion and the resurrection are the points in which Jesus has come and established his rule forever and ever and ever and ever. And it's not just, it's so different to the way we would want it. And in this passage, or the passage just before, the way Peter wanted it to be a different kind of messiahship. But this is a suffering Messiah, someone who dies in the most horrendous and shameful way. It's completely the opposite of what we would expect. But that's the way of the kingdom of God. When these guys, who he says to him, follow me, when they follow him, if they want to, they're going to suffer just like him. But when they do, what they're going to do is they're going to be building the kingdom. It's actually through their suffering. That's why he says in chapter 13, guys, you're going to be held before synagogues and rulers, and don't worry at that time. The Holy Spirit will give you words, because the opportunity has been given to you to proclaim the gospel, not to defend yourself, but to proclaim the gospel. Your suffering will result in the proclamation of the gospel and its spread. It's the opposite of what we expect. It's the opposite of what we try and do in church, perhaps some days. We think we've got to somehow make it attractive for people. We've got to somehow do these extraordinary things. Well, actually, maybe this passage suggests the way to spread the word, the way for God's kingdom to grow is through our suffering and our sacrifice and becoming weak rather than strong. So, I mean, for me, this is just an amazing. I think I've answered the question now.
Oh, well done.
Yes,
So
I'm really impressed.
in terms of being ashamed then, and the disciples were ashamed of Jesus.
Yeah.
So where's the hope in that? Is he going to be ashamed of them? Because it says there that he will be ashamed of them when he comes in the Father's glory.
That's a good question. I don't know if I can see hope in that. I'm still struggling with this idea. Was Jesus expecting them to fall away? I think he probably was. But at the same time, he probably wasn't wanting it to happen. So that's why he gets really kind of upset with them when they're found sleeping, for instance, in the Garden of Gethsemane. So there's a sense in which he can't honor them in the way that he'd wanted to. I think ashamed doesn't necessarily mean I'm embarrassed by you. It's more, I'm not able to honor you in the way that I wanted to, actually. That doesn't mean he doesn't love us. That's Peter, for instance, denies Jesus. It doesn't mean he's never restored. He is. And that's the same with us. We are fallible, frail, as we've talked about earlier. We want to do our own thing, but also sometimes we'll deny Jesus. We will, even if we don't necessarily notice it at the time, but we will. We may not even be conscious of it, but we can be embarrassed by Jesus. But that doesn't mean Jesus doesn't restore us. And love us anyway and wants us back. Forgives us completely.
There's always a way back.
There is always a way back.
I said to you, didn't I? I can't see it. I find it very hard to imagine, because for me, Jesus is just all about grace and love. So it's a tricky one for me. That's what I was saying. I'll let you do the talking about But
No, that's fine.
yeah, but I just think it shows how, because in a way that's how it should be, you know, when we come before God, but actually because of what happened on the cross and because of God's love and the grace, actually it's not like that. We're you know, we are children of God, aren't we? And you know, there's a place for us.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
absolutely. I don't think, you know, this is maybe not so much about the end times. I hope it is.
Yeah.
I hope it isn't. It might be, but I hope it isn't.
No, that's a really interesting angle. I honestly hadn't thought of it like that, Stefan.
Well, how interesting. At least 2 different levels we're looking at, probably many more than that. Does either of you want to finish with anything else that you haven't said up to now?
I think, just if you don't mind, and we talk, because we're both drama queens. I think dramatically this passage is amazing. It's just the idea of Peter being told, "Get behind me," which I think means get in line. And in this next section, the bit we're looking at, he says, "If anyone wants to come after me," in other words, come behind me. So it's all about what following Jesus is all about. And you can be out of line with Jesus like Peter was. You need to get back. You need to get back behind him. Get in sync with him, just like we were talking earlier. Let Jesus be in the driving seat. Get in sync with the program.
Yeah. Brilliant. Anne, is there anything you wanted to add? Slightly running out of time here, but you've got a minute.
I think just that I love how God speaks to us in such different ways, and even the same passage. I'm always fascinated how I can read a passage, someone else can read it, and God can be saying something completely different. But I think that's what, and I think, you know, the Bible is living and active, isn't it? It's not a set thing. These are the words, this is what it means. And I actually quite like the mystery. Like, I love books like Isaiah because it's the mystery, and you sort of, it's not obvious. You've almost got to be a poet, don't you, to understand it. And sometimes understand things on a whole different level. But just to say quickly in terms of Mark and Stefan's performance, I mean, it is one of the Gospels, isn't it? It's absolute action-packed, quick, brief, isn't it? John, I was always more of a John, I like, he's a bit mystical, isn't he? It's all about love. And actually watching your performance, just amazing. I always knew the Gospels were exciting, but you really, honestly,
thank you.
the way you bring it to life,
Well,
it
thank
makes
you.
it so exciting. Yeah,
Well,
riveting.
I owe you a lot. You've been such an encourager and a supporter. And I'm just so thrilled that I've met you. Thanks, Anne.
Oh, thank you.
Brilliant. Well, Anne and Stefan, thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts with us. I love the fact that every episode's so different and we get a chance to spend some time talking as friends about things that really matter. And it's great that you, our listeners, have been with us too, and we hope you leave with some things to ponder. Please do join us again or listen to previous episodes, which can be found on Spotify and Apple Music platforms, and even on YouTube if you'd like to see the chair and the t-shirt on one of the hottest days of the year. We'd love you to like and subscribe and tell your friends if you've enjoyed today's conversation. And we're grateful to members of the I Am Mark community group on Facebook, as well as friends who don't use social media. If you've not already involved with the I Am Mark community and would like to be, do find us on Facebook and join in the conversation. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for now. So it's goodbye from Anne Middleton.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye from Stefan Smart.
Bye-bye.
And until next time, goodbye from me. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stefan Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We'll light it up, we won't come down. and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.